All right, in the last two lessons, we practiced creating pandas series from scratch, and now that we've familiarized ourselves with the syntax, we're ready to dive into attributes and methods. And attributes and methods both go hand in hand with one another. So objects in Python have attributes and they have methods, and a pandas series is just one type of object. It's a thing that exists within this language now that we've imported pandas. And attributes return information about the object. They deliver some kind of detail about it. They deliver perhaps a summary of it or a way to look at it from a certain perspective. Attributes do not modify an object, so they don't actually manipulate it in any way or destroy it or edit it. All they do is kind of view it, observe it, and give us some information about it. That's in comparison to methods which do operate upon an object. They do perform some kind of manipulation or operation or calculation. So in this lesson, let's focus entirely on attributes, and then we'll dive into a few methods in the next lesson. So I'll begin by creating another pandas series, and this one will also be made from a Python list. So I'll create a Python list called About Me. It's just going to be strings, a bunch of adjectives to describe myself. Smart, handsome, charming, charming, brilliant, and of course, humble. Okay, so now we have a list of strings. I'm going to use my pd.series to call the series constructor method from the pandas library. I'm going to give it my about me list. And let's take a look. Here we have our values on the right side from the list. To the left, we have our automatically generated index, again, because we didn't tell pandas what to use as a custom index. The bottom has the D type. The values here are of type object, which means string. All of this is pretty familiar by now, hopefully. So what's happening here is that pandas is executing the very last line within the cell, so it's giving us that series. But it's not actually saving the series anywhere in memory. So once it's previewed to us on the screen, since it's not being stored in a variable, it's discarded from memory. In order to use and reference this series later, we'll have to store it in a variable, or rather point a variable to it. And in order to do that, I'm just going to add an equal sign in front of the series and give it a variable name. I'm going to call it S for series, just a simple one-letter variable name. And again, the easiest way to always remember this is that whatever happens on the right side of the equal sign always takes place first. So the pandas series is going to be generated first. It's going to use the values from the about me list. It's going to generate a numeric index because we didn't specify what index to use. Once that series object is entirely constructed, it's going to be the variable S is going to be used to point to it, and then we're going to have our series stored in the variable S. Now simply executing this will not preview anything because the last line is now the assignment of the series, and that doesn't actually output anything. So if we want to see the result, we can put S as our evaluation on the last line. That's going to be what's going to be output below that cell, and that way we can actually see that S is now storing our 5-item series. All right, so now that we have our series stored in the variable S, we can go ahead and access some of its attributes. Now the syntax is going to be very similar to how we created a series. It's not exactly a method, so it's not going to require parentheses, but otherwise the syntax is identical. We're going to begin with our object, which in this case is S. We're then going to place a dot. That's called dot notation. And let's press the tab key at this juncture to take a look at all of the available options. So what we see here is all of the attributes and methods that are available just on this series object called S. So we've moved out of that pandas library, and now we're focused on this object that's a series. And these are all the things that we can do or find out about the S series. So I want to access just 3 attributes in this lesson to give you a sense of how attributes work. I'm going to begin with values, so I'm going to start typing it. And there it is. So s.values, it's an attribute, so it does not require parentheses at the end. That's one syntactical difference between attributes and methods. And let's execute the cell and see what happens. So values is going to return an array of all of the values within the series. So you can think of it as saying, take this little chunk, take this section of our series, and just give it back to me as an array. Now again, it's an attribute, so it's not manipulating, it's not changing those values, it's not shuffling them around, it's just giving them to me as an array. It's kind of like extracting that piece of the puzzle and outputting it to me below. Similarly, there's a complementary attribute called index. And what that does is focus on the index component of our S series. This is going to return an object. It's called the range index, so it's a little bit different from the values result above. But basically, think of all of these things as different puzzle pieces or different machine parts that come together to make the final series. And right now we're kind of focusing on one of them at a time. So we're taking a look at the values, and now we're taking a look at the object that makes up the index that we see on the left right here. And the index is made up of its own separate object called range index, which comes from pandas. And in here we can see a little bit of a description about how it operates. We can see that it starts at 0, which is true. We have our 0 up here. It stops at 5, which is true. It goes up to 4 and stops there. And this last part is called step, and that's telling us that it's incrementing by 1. So it's starting at 0 and then going to 1 and then going to 2 and so on. So this is the object that makes up the index in our actual data frame, or rather our series. And finally, there's one more attribute that I want to explore in this lesson, and that's the dtype attribute. And that's just the chunk that we see down here. If we execute this cell, it's going to give us a dtype of O, which is short for object, which again is internal pandas lingo for a string. So these attributes, we've used them to kind of take apart that big series and look at it chunk by chunk, piece by piece. We took a look at the values of it by looking at the values attribute. We looked at the index of it by looking at the index attribute, and we asked pandas to tell us about its dtype by using the dtype attribute. And all of these have been accessed on our series, which is stored in the S variable. So again, attributes are just a way that we can use to find out information about the components that make up a series. Sometimes we'll dive into more attributes later. Sometimes attributes give us a little bit of a summary or description about a series, but they don't actually modify it or do anything with it. They're very passive. That's in comparison to methods which do operate or perform some kind of operation or calculation. And we'll see a little bit more of methods in the upcoming lesson.